is an island that children visit in their dreams, and where anything can happen. To reach it, you have to be able to fly. Peter could fly. Sometimes, when he felt lonely, he went back to the human world and listened at nursery windows to the bedtime stories mothers told their children. 3 children called Wendy, Michael and John Darling lived with their parents near Kensington Gardens. This was one of Peter's favourite places. You can see a statue of him there. The children had an unusual nurse called Nana. She was a big Newfoundland dog who slept in a kennel in the nursery. If she had been on guard the night Peter came, this story would never have happened. Mrs. Darling was a happy woman who hugged and kissed her children often. Mr. Darling was more serious. He worried a lot and did not think it was a good idea to have a dog for a nursemaid. Mrs. Darling used to tell the children bedtime stories every night. Then she took them in and lit their night lights. So this picture shows Mrs. Darling telling her children a bedtime story. As she tidied up the nursery, she would wonder what they were dreaming about. If Mrs. Darling could have seen into their minds, she would have seen a picture map of the island of Neverland. It had a lagoon, a pirate ship, flamingos and a coral reef. There was a forest with wild beasts, savages and fairies. Mrs. Darling was puzzled because the children talked so much about a boy called Peter Pan. They said he lived with the fairies. Mr. Darling thought it must be some silly tale Nana had told them. "It all comes from having a dog as a nurse," he grumbled. One day Mrs. Darling found some leaves just under the nursery window. "Peter must have dropped them," said Wendy. "He's so untidy." "But it's 3 floors up. How could he get here?" said Mrs. Darling. "You must have been dreaming." But Wendy had not been dreaming. The very next night Mrs. Darling was sewing by the nursery fire and had almost fallen asleep. The window blew open and a boy dropped in on the floor. He was dressed all in leaves. A strange little light followed him, darting around the room like a living thing. It woke Mrs. Darling, who knew at once that the boy was Peter Pan. She cried out in alarm, and Nana sprang at the boy, who leapt back through the window. Nana closed it, just catching his shadow by the feet. Nana picked up the shadow and took it to her mistress, who rolled it up and put it in a drawer. The following Friday, Mr. and Mrs. Darling were invited to a party at a house a few doors away. Mr. Darling was very cross with Nana and decided she had to be chained up in the yard. Mrs. Darling was worried because Nana kept barking. "That's not her usual bark," she said. "She only barks like that when there's danger." "Nonsense," said Mr. Darling. "Hurry up or we'll be late for the party." As the front door closed, a bright light appeared in the nursery, darting into drawers and cupboards. When the light stayed still for a moment, you could see it was not a light at all, but a fairy called Tinker Bell. The next moment, Peter himself came through the window. "Come on, Tink, wherever you are," he said, "and show me where my shadow is." Tinker Bell told him it was in a drawer. She spoke in a golden tinkle like a chime of tiny bells. Peter pulled out his shadow and shut the drawer, forgetting that Tinker Bell was still inside. He tried to stick his shadow back on with water, then with soap, but just before we go on to the next page, here is Peter Pan coming through the window, and here is Tinker Bell. Nothing worked. He was in despair when Wendy woke up. "What's the matter?" she asked. "My shadow won't stick on," Peter complained. "Give it to me," said Wendy. "I'll sew it on." Peter was thrilled to have his shadow back, and Wendy was so pleased that she offered him a kiss. Peter had never heard of a kiss, but he thought it must be a present, so he held out his hand. Wendy gave him her thimble instead, and forever after that he called a kiss a thimble. In return for the thimble, Peter gave Wendy an acorn button from his coat. She put it on a chain around her neck. Later on, it would save her life. Peter told Wendy all about how he had run away to live with the fairies in Kensington Gardens. Now, he lived in the Neverland with the Lost Boys. The Lost